Hello again, and welcome to Lam Rim. So we're still on chapter 17 of the Lam Rim Chenmo on the object of negation. I think this is the third session so far on this chapter. But before we start, let's try to set our motivation to recognize that the path of enlightenment requires us to develop insight. We need to understand how our ignorance leads to suffering and how to eliminate that ignorance. And why do we do this? Well, we have our own personal suffering and causes of suffering that we want to get rid of, but also we recognize the suffering in others, that they are similar to ourselves, they're the same as us. You and I could be the same in these ways. It could be me listening. So in that sense, we have a sense of empathy. We feel like, oh, and this is not just my issue. This is a common issue. This is very common. And recognizing that and seeing how difficult it is to eliminate suffering, and recognizing just how entrenched within us it is, we develop this strong sense of compassion, wanting to benefit all. And so from that we tread the path of the bodhisattva in order to take on the responsibility for removing suffering of all. Right now I'm very unable to do very much. I can hardly help myself, let alone anybody else. So first of all, I must turn my compassion inwards and develop enlightenment, and then I can help others. So best thing really not to try to benefit everybody right now, but to learn how to benefit. It's like being wanting to help people who are ill. It's a good idea to learn a bit of medicine first. So let's try to think that way, and I can't guarantee again that what I'm saying is correct, but I'm doing my best, and I'm hoping that something resonates and is of value. So that's where we are. So last session we discussed, while it's important for us not to intellectualize, but instead to experience insight for ourselves, we need to use reasoning to guide our meditation. So we also then began to look at how ignorance binds us to samsara, to this continual suffering, cycle of suffering, through the 12 links of dependent origination. And this session, what I really want to do is just to conclude that. I talked quite a lot last session, so I felt it's a good idea just to conclude that aspect of the 12 of the relationship between ignorance and the 12 links of dependent origination. And then next session we'll be moving on to looking at conceptuality and some of the ideas that we might have about conceptuality, and in terms of what it is we're really trying to do in terms of focusing on what it is that we need to eliminate in terms of the object of negation, right? The self, which is sort of the known as the aspect of anatta that we're trying to eliminate, selflessness. So it's on 210 page. So essentially, we can ask ourselves, well, why does Buddha teach dependent origination, and indeed why did Nagarjuna spend a lot of his text, his root text, talking of dependent origination? And to be clear, I mean, dependent origination is the basis of a huge section of the sutras that were taught by Buddha, both according to the Pali tradition and also to the modern Sanskrit traditions as well, or relatively modern, I should say. They're only 2,000 years old. So what can we see this is that essentially there's something about dependent origination which is very important, or dependent arising, dependent origination, same meaning here. And Nagarjuna was wanting to put the emphasis on this because he says that it actually teaches us, or it establishes within us an understanding of reality as it is, if we understand it correctly. So once we grasp dependent arising correctly, because of the way in which it relates to a causal flow, and allows for us to understand how interdependence arises, then this gives us a clue into, in fact, points directly at selflessness. And Je Rinpoche cites seeing what is real, seeing what is not real, we are bound. As seeing the real, we are free. So then, in terms of this, paraphrasing from his question from right at the beginning of the chapter on insight, he said, "What is the reality of things, just as it is? What does this mean?" And he reiterates. So we've been through some of this before, but he says this is the absence of an essence, if you like. So until our ignorance is removed, we imagine an essence in entities, and we generate attachment and hostility in regards. In respect to them. So this innate, we're born with it, a false perception. It's completely not present. It's completely absent. But the appearance is absent. What we see it, but it's not there. It is somehow that this merely designated, completely transient, superimposed collection of parts that arise and decay within an interdependent causal flow. It somehow exists in and of itself. So we've described it as it doesn't have any substance on its side. It appears to do so, and therefore, because it appears to have this thing in itself, a sort of appearance of being on it, something in its own right, it's then somehow that what it does is it somehow makes it worthy of our attachment or our hostility. We become fascinated by it rather than recognizing it for being really merely a designation, merely a way of looking at something. And this is the sort of apparent snake that we keep on putting onto our hose pipes, the hose pipes of everything around us and ourselves included, right? So, and the thing is, essentially, when we bind ourselves, not only are we limiting ourselves to creating these objects, which then we need to relate to, we need to emote about, we need to become fascinated by, we need to bring them towards us or shove them away or be completely disinterested in them, but we're still relating to them as being things. And having that sort of provided this sort of concrete or sort of existent, solid, independent nature that we perceive very, very subtly, but it's there, then we find it hard to find alternative views for them as well. So we end up being a bit fixated this way. So Je Rinpoche then wants to just breaks down the chain for us, how in terms of the 12 links of interdependent origination, or dependent origination, he says that, once we correctly understand dependent arising, then we correctly understand causality. We understand, likewise, we also understand transience. We understand the way in which things arise. We don't need to know all the details. We just know the general case. And the consequence of correctly understanding causality is a correct understanding of selflessness, because when we see causality correctly, we understand that the idea of independence or somehow creation on its own side is just not possible, feasible, right? So a consequence of correctly understanding selflessness in this way is the end of the ignorance, which lies at the root of suffering. So this specific ignorance regarding the nature of reality is destroyed, and when that is destroyed, the end of that ignorance is a recognition of the lack of this essence in entities, both things around us, but also ourselves and all entities. So a consequence of that recognition, of recognizing the lack of this essence, is that if we understand it correctly, if our understanding of this lack of essence is correct, is experiential, then we lose our fascination for them, because they become merely designations. They are just mere designations. They are just as a way of looking at things, or a way of labeling things, or labeling, if you like. So the things themselves are labelings. Yeah. So it's not about language. This is about perception, how we perceive things. So then, once we are no longer fascinated, then we're no longer subject to the afflictions that arise from that fascination. So this is not normally called self-grasping. It's not just towards ourselves; it's towards the way in which we perceive everything. So then that lack of fascination frees us from all the things of wanting to grasp at them, because it's like, who wants to grasp at a word, essentially, right? So it's like, oh yeah, merely a part of a causal flow. A consequence of no longer being subject to the afflictions that arise from that fascination is that we've freed ourselves from the causes of suffering. So the point here is an affliction, a mental affliction, such as grasping or malice and so on. They're called afflictions because they are causes of suffering. So it follows that if we have cut the root and we've cut the basis of these afflictions, then we've cut the basis of the causes of our suffering. Right. And a consequence of being freed from the causes of suffering is that we are liberated. We are free from the burden of suffering. And that's the point. So I call this a sort of forward to backward reasoning, because it shows how insight leads to liberation or to freedom. But it's also useful, I think it's very useful also to look at it from the other way around, and to see how the dependencies, what dependencies are required in order to generate freedom. So we can do it forwards to backwards, or backwards to forwards as well. And then when we do that, we can see clearly that anything that frees us essentially from this a fascination is it is going to work, right? So so the nature of how we do that, the path by which we do that, in terms of recognizing, understanding what it is that underlies that grasping, might change in terms of the methodologies used or the language used, but generally, as long as it removes that ignorance, then there's no problem about it. So we don't need to think, well, this is the, the middle way school is the best school, if you like. I think that the point is that it works. The middle way school works, and it seems to work very well for many people. That doesn't make it the best in one sense, but I also feel that while it is called the middle way school, and there are many lamas and teachers who call it, the Madhyamaka, and differentiates it from the Chittamatra, and even divides it into the various different sub schools, if you like, and so on. and the point being is that by the time we get to Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti, we have reconciled how Buddha's own sutras demonstrate emptiness or selflessness. So it's because if we recognize the way in which the methodology in terms of the causality, the causal chain of how ignorance defeats, how insight defeats ignorance, and that itself defeats suffering, then we see that any of these different methods of cutting ignorance are not necessarily exclusive. They're just ways of being able to do that. And this includes the middle way school. So you might say, oh, hang on, what are you saying? I mean, Chandrakirti himself says in the towards the end of his entry to the middle way, the Madhyamaka Vatara, he says, just as no other source presents this Dharma in this accurate way, the wise should recognize that what I've written is quite unique. You know, he says what is found within, but so this, in a sense, right at the end of chapter 11. So this verse is used by many Tibetan teachers to claim that Madhyamaka is really the only path to insight. But I don't think this is what Chandrakirti intends. I think he points out that, and he's right, he's pointed out that he has reconciled many of the contemporary disputes regarding Nagarjuna. I mean, he came 700 years after Nagarjuna, and he, at that time, there were many different ideas about what Nagarjuna was saying, just as there are now. One of the sort of great exercises we can find across the whole world are philosophers throwing themselves at the Mula Madhyamika Karika and trying to work out what it means. And Chandrakirti is like, seen that happening a lot already in the last few hundred years since it was written. So what he's saying is he's managed to resolve all of the many disputes, many different lacks of clarity regarding Nagarjuna's masterwork, and he doesn't say that Madhyamaka is the only correct view. In fact, he says that this Dharma, not the Dharma, this Dharma is referring to the Mula Madhyamika Karika, which he's commenting on in this particular work. I think his contribution was definitely to show how Nagarjuna is reconciling Buddha's teachings with the path to insight. So, in a sense, you could argue that the middle way school is really not a distinct school at all, in terms of the fact that what it wants to do is to show how Buddha himself, in his teachings on things like anicca, subtle impermanence, and also on the 12 links of dependent arising, was pointing to his assertion of selflessness. In fact, we could argue the case because the four threads of reasoning I mentioned last session, in causality, impermanence, composition, and designation, these are found within the sutra, in many places within the sutras themselves. So therefore, in one sense, what Nagarjuna was doing was saying, look, here they are. We don't need to be involved in philosophizing when we've got such a strong, clear message from Buddha. And some people would dispute that, say, well, it was pretty hidden until you revealed it to us. And Chandrakirti was saying we need to stay clear. We need to remember that we're not adding to this. What we're trying to do is to use this to point to ignorance. So all of this, and again, is very importantly, isn't about trying to establish how the world is. It's trying to work out how to eliminate the assumptions that we put onto the world. And that's really very relevant here. So for me, what I feel is sort of relevant here is that within the practice of the middle way tradition and the middle way methodologies is where pointing, where, as I said, we've got the point that Buddha's pointing to, very clearly pointing to insight, showing us what is not there that we imagine to be there. without having to establish any sort of form of a formal philosophy or mysticism, or sort of saying, you know, oh, it's impossible to know. In fact, he says, look, just follow these lines, you'll be able to see very clearly. But I do feel, and I said this just a minute ago, that while Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna's contributions are unique, but then everything is unique, it's very hard to make the claim that they are somehow objectively the best. And why is because in one sense, or quite clearly, in light of the nature of reality that we are working to see, to perceive, or to recognize, we can't say that such and such is the best or the most valid. And why? Because we've got to recognize the context within which it's in. We need to place it within the scope or the boundaries of its dependent arising. It's not a thing in itself anyway. So this aspect of saying, well, it's recognizing that the teaching of the Madhyamaka itself is composite, is transient, and so on, right? So it shows to us that the idea of saying this is the most valid is sort of, in a sense, overstepping a mark that can't be made. Because we'd also, even we were saying, okay, well, some things are more true than others, and there's no doubt about that. But the point about it is to say that when we're looking at methodologies for understanding insight, then we have to sort of say, well, there would need to be some sort of objective metric, some sort of completely universal assessment ability to assess. And if we have that, then we've really lost the whole point of selflessness. Because there's no true objective existence, right? So that sort of except for, you know, to start, but the point about that is that that doesn't give us a way of establishing what is. It helps us to establish what is not. So I'm happy to be corrected on this. I might be way off here, but I think this follows with some of the teachings given by, for instance, Khyentse Yeshe Tubten Rinpoche and so on. So anyway, going back to the discussion at hand, and we're talking about the dependent arising and as a means of understanding his selflessness. Rinpoche mentions how Buddha Palita, in his commentary on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, where so far, although not explicitly necessarily, Nagarjuna has been depending upon Mahayana sutras to explain these various different points in his text. And Buddha Palita sort of says, you know, a voice from the back says, well, okay, you've done all of this work. How does all this reconcile with the insight of a Sravaka? In other words, from the Pali Sutras. And Buddha Palita sort of says chapter 26. He doesn't, he sort of, in terms of the text, he starts reciting the first few lines of chapter 26, which are the chapters of the chapter that describes and explains dependent arising. So what he's saying is that if we want to understand that what we're talking about within the middle way tradition in terms of understanding things, this is not different from, this is not unique to the Mahayana. This is found in any strand of Buddhism. And then somebody says, what about wrong views? You know, you say, okay, well, this is establishing insight, but what about wrong views or mistaken views? And Buddha Palita says chapter 27, which is again uses sutras that are found both within the Mahayana and also the Sravaka in Pali. So this is to demonstrate that that these methods within the Madhyamaka, the middle way school, are both, or tradition, are known or refer to the experiential insight, which is not distinguished by whether or not you've chosen or we've chosen to take a bodhisattva path, a path to full Buddhahood. is the path to insight and not exclusive to the Mahayana at all. So the point about this is, and Rinpoche is trying to make, is that this it gives a solid ground to recognize the wisdom that all liberated beings have is the same wisdom. So the fact that we've identified it as being the first of the 12 independent links, the affliction of ignorance, means that it is likewise the same ignorance that needs to be overturned by anybody who is liberated. And because this this way of seeing things involves the superimposition of the essence on things as well as on ourselves, that we have to recognize that correct insight, regardless of our tradition, also recognizes the selflessness of objects, not just of the person. And the point about this is that there are some schools of thought that say, no, those Ravakas don't recognize the selflessness of objects. They only recognize the selflessness of person. So this is really a way of saying there are a couple of aspects within our understanding is to be clear that when we talk about anatta, anatman, selflessness, we're not just talking about the selflessness of person. Our emphasis, our first practice has to be developing a freedom from this sort of great big thirsty black hole that orients the entire universe around ourselves. That we need to eliminate first anyway, and this is the afflictive ignorance. But a consequence of when we do that, and some of the methods that we use in order to do that, involve us recognizing the selflessness of objects. And also it helps us to break down both sides of the equation of in terms of afflictions. So not only do we remove the selflessness, the apparent snake of ourselves, but also of the objects that we are attracted to or repelled by. So from a practical viewpoint, I want to go back to the chain again a little bit, how the consequence of understanding dependent arising leads to liberation through recognizing, eliminating ignorance. So I think this really, and also it applies to the various different strands of reasoning. And I think that there are many modern people. I think there have probably always been people who find it, who recognize the truth of the transitory, momentariness, dissipation, continually changing nature of all entities. Right, everything is continually changing. We see that Heraclitus talks about the river changing continually. So this is not something unique to Buddhism, and it's something that I think many people recognize and can see it. And likewise, this sort of aspect of impermanence, that if it's momentary, then it will dissipate. This is something I think is available to us. And likewise, I think I can imagine that many of us can see how we are compositional. We're made of parts, and also really that the way in which we are made of parts is all there is. It's just a bundle of parts. There's nothing on top of it that we might superimpose a layer, but we are just a bundle of parts. And again, and that such components, parts, can be chosen in completely arbitrary ways. So also we can see, I mean, for instance, we can find in a psychology dictionary or whatever that the innate appearance of me, the self, the personal self, is a psychological construct that that's just made up of an incoherent collection of impulses, conditions, reinforced by sort of social and personal narratives. So why do I mention this? So to me, it seems that we might be familiar with these. We might be familiar with all of these different things, these different aspects. We might be, but just because we are familiar with them does not necessarily mean that we recognize the impact of them or how important they are. We don't use them or we don't exploit them. So I think one of the aspects that we might miss on is recognizing just how the view of self, the superimposition of this self, is actually toxic to us. It's not like we're sort of saying, I think many of these people sort of were very quickly to identify and reject acquired views such as the soul and so on. This is like very clearly is like very hard to accept that if we understand these things, but to recognize that this sort of innate sense of self is actually toxic to us requires a different type of insight altogether. And therefore, because of that, we still think and act as if our apparent self, the snake, which is just a hose pipe, is really here, and we depend upon it. So this is why really I mentioned last session, and I can't really emphasize too much that we need to be satisfied just that the ignorance which imagines this imaginary self, true self, is or this essence is indeed the cause of our misery. And so we need to revisit and revisit that causal chain to understand just how that works, to eliminate our doubts. And again, we need to experience that. We need to experience our understanding so we can feel it. We can actually recognize it. So it's a bit like, I think maybe it was Pauli, but one of the physicists said, you know, I know from being a physicist that when that the sun doesn't rotate around the earth. I know that it's just the earth rotating around its own axis that creates day and night. But when I go to the beach, me and my wife, we sit there drinking a martini and we watch the sun go down, right? Or we watch the sun come up. So this idea is to say he understands it, but he doesn't see it as being important for him, if you like, to keep it on his mind. He's very happy to enjoy watching the sun go down with his wife and say what a beautiful sunset, despite the fact he knows that there is no sun going down at all. It is merely the earth turning. And it is like sort of maybe he's saying something else, which is, I don't want to say to my wife, what a lovely earth turn. But the point I'm trying to make here is that without recognizing the impact that this idea has on us, we can still be left with these toxic effects. So it's important for us to recognize that not only while those strands of reasoning may be very available to us, it's when we knowing that we need to apply them and be rigorous in our application that they begin to start actually having an impact on us. So again, when I talk about experience and having our own experience with things, I sort of feel I'm not talking about sort of becoming enlightened or becoming an Arya being through this sort of what's known as a direct yogic perceiver, or something we have to develop through samatha or serenity. I'm really just really talking about the idea that our experiential understanding is similar to like how we know when we know that our nose is itching. So it's this sort of experiential, this sort of actually something that we live and breathe, rather than something that we sort of think about in a sort of rather interesting intellectual way, and then we put it back on the shelf and we get on with something else. So if we can do that, we can tie this into our experiential life, then it begins to have meaning. Otherwise, we really are sort of just missing the mark. Although we might know that the hose is a snake, and we've gone, oh yeah, see, the hose is a snake, we still behave as if it's a snake, and that's the point. So Essentially, we might think, oh yes, I completely understand the middle way philosophy, and it's trivially easy for me and this sort of thing. It's like, yeah, but this sort of what it's done is generate pride for us, right? If we need to experience it, then that actually begins to have an effect. So we have to be really clear about putting this into practice, putting it into our lives, making it real, if you like, realizing it. So I think one of the other things in brief, before I finish this session, is to think really a little bit about the path to insight in terms of some of the dependencies that we've mentioned so far. What, in other words, sort of what do we need to put into our backpack on our journey to insight, right? So I think this is sort of for us to determine for ourselves. But I think that we definitely will need some sort of ability in critical thinking. This just means we need to be able to understand a valid argument, a coherent argument, and recognize hidden assumptions and how to overturn them. So these are the basic aspects of critical thinking, being able to be fair and let go of our convictions. I think secondly is to be able to correctly identify what this innate ignorance is that we're working to eliminate, what it is that we're trying to get rid of, not something else. I think also then, and what we've been talking about today and previous session, is understand and accept just how this ignorance is the cause of our afflictions, the root cause of our suffering. And again, we need to do this in an experiential manner. We've got to develop a courage and determination to find out the truth for ourselves, rather than just sort of say, oh yeah, one day I'll do that, or yeah, this all sounds too complicated to me. So we need to say, okay, actually I need to do this. I'm going to do this. So then the strands of reasoning that are available to us, to use them to experience the ignorance as it occurs. So these strands of reasoning, we need to develop them, and then we need to be able to apply them. And again, we need to be able to hone them so that they can work to break down this sense of self, or sense of entityhood as it arises. So in order to do that, we need to have some mindfulness and vigilance in our life, to be able to have some awareness of how our thoughts, our motives, and our reactions arise, and when they arise, so that we can use the opportunity there. So then again, we are looking here both on the meditation seat, but also off the meditation seat, when it actually often becomes much more relevant for us to deal practically with this. So then the ability to notice within ourselves. So this is really, a lot of these are tied together, but to the ability to notice within ourselves this arising of this innate presupposition of the apparent truth, which our minds, which sort of fascinates us, captivates us, and motivates us, that we become motivated by. And firstly, that most cherished imaginary friend, the me that seeps into everything and everywhere, right? From which we imagine the universe revolves around, or our universe revolves around. And then similarly, the essence of entities that makes them worthy of fascination, of being something that, oh, I really want this, right? So that sort of, oh, I don't want that, oh, horrible. So that sense, essentially, being able to see for ourselves just how that fascination leads to the afflictions of attachment and hostility and pride and so on. So I think this is just maybe not very useful, but the idea primarily is to begin to think about, okay, well, these are why we've been talking about these things. We need to establish these sort of tools, these abilities, then we can really eliminate this, begin to work on eliminating this mistake that we have in our minds. So next session, we'll talk about conceptuality. I think probably that's all we'll be able to do. Is there's the following section on conceptuality within the same chapter, but let's now just hope that something from this session has been useful for us, and if so, then to think, okay, well, let's use this for our practice. Let's put some energy into dedicate some time into actually bringing this about and making it happen. Remembering our motive, which we established right at the beginning, which is for the purpose of enlightenment. And then let's just sit for a minute or two.